The Yoon penthouse didn't overlook Seoul, it judged it. Walls of seamless glass stretched like frozen curtains over a city of neon reflected a room where the air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood and old blood. In the corners of the ceiling, security cameras blinked like unfeeling red eyes. This was a sanctuary of calculated silence, built by a dynasty that used whispers to topple governments and steel to silence the rest. Jalaiah Opal moved through the dining hall like a ghost in a silk vest. Her server's uniform was crisp, her expression a mask of professional invisibility. She'd accepted the assignment that afternoon, desperate, her rent due, the weight of her daughter's future mounting like a debt she couldn't pay. The agency's instructions were cold and clear. The Yoon family pays triple. They also expect absolute silence. Don't look at the guests. Don't listen to the business. Act as if you don't exist. But Jalaiah would soon learn that being invisible is a dangerous game when you're standing in a room full of monsters. The head of security, a man with a scar slicing through his eyebrow, handed her a crystal decanter and gestured toward the head of the table, where the Ice Queen sat. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The Yoon penthouse didn't just overlook Seoul. It sat atop the Lotte World Tower like a crown of cold glass, detached from the warmth of the world below. As the elevator ascended 60 stories in a pressurized hush, Jalaiah Opal tightened her grip on 5-year-old Ivory's hand. The elevator doors hissed open to reveal a foyer of polished obsidian and white marble, illuminated by a chandelier that looked like a cluster of falling daggers. "Remember, Ivory," Jalaiah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the climate control. "Stay in the staff lounge. Don't wander, and don't make a sound. Mommy just needs to finish this one shift." Ivory nodded, her dark eyes wide as she took in the statues of snarling tigers that guarded the entrance. She clutched her plush toy to her chest, her small frame looking even more fragile against the towering, clinical elegance of the fortress. Jalaiah felt a familiar pang of guilt. She shouldn't have brought her daughter to a private event, but the babysitter had bailed, and the high-risk pay for this catering gig was the only thing that would cover the mounting bills from the immigration lawyers. The head of security, a man whose tailored black suit couldn't hide the military stiffness of his shoulders, met them at the threshold. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply swept a metal detector wand over Jalaiah, the device chirping aggressively near her waist. "Staff entrance is to the left," he said in clipped, accented English. His eyes lingered on Ivory with a flicker of cold annoyance. "The child stays out of sight. If the Ice Queen sees a stray hair in the dining hall, you'll be out on the street before the first course is served." Jalaiah swallowed her pride, nodding as she led Ivory toward the service wing. The air in the penthouse felt thin, pressurized by the presence of Yoon Haeju, the woman they called the Ice Queen. As Jalaiah changed into her crisp white server's vest, she could hear the low, rhythmic murmur of men's voices coming from the grand hall. It was a language she lived in but didn't speak, a barrier she had always found comforting until tonight. As she prepared the silver platters, she didn't notice Ivory sitting quietly by the kitchen vent, her head tilted, listening to the echoes from the dining room with a focus that no 5-year-old should possess. Jalaiah hoisted the first tray of whiskey decanters, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stepped through the swinging doors into a world of sandalwood smoke and sharp suits, unaware that the predator in the room wasn't the woman at the head of the table, but the secret already taking root in her daughter's mind. The air in the grand hall was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and a tension that felt like a piano wire stretched to its breaking point. Jalaiah moved with practiced grace, weaving between the heavy mahogany chairs of men who didn't even bother to pull their feet back as she passed. At the head of the table sat Yoon Haeju, her face a sculpted mask of porcelain and indifference. She was the Ice Queen for a reason. She didn't look at Jalaiah. She looked through her, as if the woman pouring her 12-year-old scotch were merely a ghost in the machinery of her empire. Across the table, a lieutenant with a jagged scar across his knuckles laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. He leaned toward his companion, gesturing toward Jalaiah with a flick of his chin. "Look at this one," he sneered in rapid-fire Korean, his voice dripping with a condescension that needed no translation. "They bring in these Americans and think a clean shirt makes them human. She's probably wondering if she'll get a tip big enough to buy her way out of the slums." Jalea kept her eyes on the crystal glass, her hands steady despite the heat rising in her chest. She had heard it all before, the assumptions, the casual cruelty of men who felt powerful by diminishing others. She let the words wash over her like rain on glass, maintaining her mask of professional deafness. She was just the help, a shadow that didn't understand the language of the elite. "It doesn't matter," the second man replied, swirling his drink. "By tomorrow, she won't even have a job to come back to. We're cleaning house, starting with the woman at the head of the table. Why waste breath mocking a servant when the queen herself is about to be dethroned?" Haishu remained silent, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the city lights, seemingly oblivious to the mutinous subtext of the conversation. The men laughed again, emboldened by their belief that Jalea was a silent, empty vessel. They leaned in closer, their voices dropping into a conspiratorial register as they discussed the delivery scheduled for the docks at midnight, a conversation that should have been kept for the shadows, but was instead laid bare because they believed Jalea was illiterate to their world. But Jalea wasn't the only one listening. In the shadows of the service hallway, the kitchen vent carried every word, every sharp syllable, directly to the small ears of a girl who had spent the last 2 years in a local kindergarten. Ivory sat on a milk crate, her brow furrowed. She didn't understand the politics of the Ice Queen, but she understood the word for betrayal. She understood the word for killing. And most importantly, she understood that the men were making fun of her mommy. As Jalea turned to retreat into the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of Ivory's face through the crack in the door. The little girl wasn't afraid. She was focused. She stood up, her plush toy forgotten on the floor, and stepped into the light of the grand hall. The silence that followed Ivory's entrance into the grand hall was absolute, the kind of stillness that precedes a lightning strike. The men at the table froze, their glasses suspended halfway to their lips, as the small girl in the bright pink sneakers marched toward the head of the table. Jalea felt the blood drain from her face, her hands trembling as she reached out to grab her daughter, but Ivory was already standing directly in front of Yoonhae-ju. The Ice Queen didn't flinch. She looked down at the child with a curious, predatory tilt of her head. For the first time that night, the mask of porcelain indifference cracked, replaced by a sharp, lethal focus. "Why are you out of the room, little one?" Haiju asked in English, her voice like cracking ice. Ivory didn't look at the men who had mocked her mother. She looked only at the woman in the black silk dress. Then, in a voice as clear and haunting as a bell, she spoke in perfect, unaccented Korean. "Kanetsa Nuna." The effect was instantaneous. The lieutenant with the scarred knuckles dropped his glass, the crystal shattering against the marble floor. The 2 men beside him surged to their feet, their chairs scraping back with a violent screech. The 3 words, "It's over, big sister," were the exact signal for the coup, a phrase intended to be whispered only after the Ice Queen's heart had stopped beating. "Where did you hear that?" Haiju asked, her voice dropping into a register that made the air in the room vibrate. She didn't look at the child. Her eyes were locked onto the lieutenant, whose hand was now hovering near the small of her back. "The man in the hallway," Ivory said, switching back to English as she pointed toward the security foyer. "He told the phone that it's over. He said he wouldn't be the boss anymore." Jalea lunged forward, scooping Ivory into her arms, her maternal instinct screaming that the air had turned poisonous. She saw the lieutenant's hand dive into his jacket, and in the same heartbeat she saw Haiju beneath the table. "Jalea, run!" Haiju roared, dropping her English pretenses entirely. A gunshot tore through the sandalwood smoke, the bullet burying itself in the mahogany table inches from where Ivory had been standing. The grand hall erupted into a cacophony of shattered glass and shouted orders. Jalea didn't wait to see who was winning. She ducked low, shielding Ivory's body with her own, and sprinted toward the only exit the gunmen wouldn't be watching, the service lift that led to the building's industrial guts. The secret was out, the blood was flowing, and the language Ivory had worked so hard to learn had just turned them into the most hunted people in Seoul. The crash of the service doors behind them cut off the sound of the firefight, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. In the narrow, fluorescent-lit corridors of the industrial wing, the air smelled of floor wax and ozone. Jalea's lungs burned, her heart thumping against Ivory's back as she carried her daughter in a frantic, lopsided sprint. She didn't head for the main elevators. She knew the traitors would have those locked down within seconds, turning the sleek glass cars into vertical coffins. "Mommy, why are they mad?" Ivory whispered into her neck, her small hands clutching Jalea's server vest. "Don't talk, baby. Just hold on tight," Jalea rasped. She reached a junction and skidded to a halt. To a guest, this was a maze of dead ends, but to a caterer, it was a map of survival. She knew that every luxury penthouse had ghost infrastructure, a network of freight lifts, trash chutes, and laundry flumes designed to keep the mess of service away from the eyes of the elite. She bypassed the freight lift, too slow, too loud, and dove toward a heavy steel door marked Maintenance Level 3. Behind it lay the gravity-fed laundry chute, a cavernous stainless steel vein that ran straight down to the basement sorting facility. It was a terrifying drop, but it was the only path the security cameras wouldn't be tracking. As she fumbled with the latch, a heavy thud echoed from the hallway they had just left. Boot prints hammered on the linoleum. The Ice Queen's men were coming, and they weren't coming to offer a tip. "Jalea!" a voice barked. She spun around, and merging from the shadows was Yoon Hae-ju. The mafia lady's silk dress was torn at the shoulder, and she held a compact silver handgun with the practiced ease of someone who had been born with iron in her hand. Her porcelain face was streaked with a single line of blood, but her eyes were cold and focused. "The stairs are blocked," Yoon Hae-ju said, her breathing heavy but controlled. "They've cut the power to the main grid. We're trapped on the 60th floor." "Not if we go through the chute," Jalea said, kicking the laundry door open. The dark metal throat of the building yawned open before them. "It feeds into the linens in the basement. It's a 60-foot drop, but the bags at the bottom will break the fall." Yoon Hae-ju looked at the dark hole, then at the sound of the gunman rounding the corner. She didn't hesitate. She stepped toward Jalea, her hand resting briefly on the woman's shoulder, a fleeting moment of alliance between the server and the sovereign. "Go," Yoon commanded. "I'll follow. If we hit the basement, we have 3 minutes before they realize we didn't use the roof." Jalea pulled Ivory into her lap, tucked her chin, and stepped into the vault. The world became a blurring slide of cold steel and screaming wind, the hidden veins of the tower swallowing them whole, as the first spray of gunfire sparked against the door they had just closed. The descent was a violent, metallic roar. Jalea clutched Ivory so tightly she feared she might bruise her, their bodies tumbling through the dark throat of the skyscraper until they hit the basement linen pile with a bone-jarring thud. Seconds later, Hae-ju landed beside them, rolling off the mountain of white sheets with a predator's grace, her silver handgun already sweeping the dim, cavernous laundry room. "Move," Hae-ju hissed, grabbing Jalea by the arm. "The vibration sensors in the chute will alert the security hub. They'll be in the basement in 90 seconds. They didn't head for the parking garage. That was the first place a professional would choke. Instead, Hae-ju led them back toward the central lift core, not to go down, but to go up. She used a heavy, gold-rimmed keycard on a hidden service panel, and a small reinforced lift groaned to life. "The roof?" Jalea whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You said we'd be trapped." "The helipad is compromised, but the construction crane on the north face isn't," Hae-ju replied, her eyes tracking the floor numbers as they ascended. "My brother thinks I'll run for the street. He's forgotten that I built this fortress. I know where the glass is thin." They burst onto the roof, the night air of Seoul hitting them like a cold sheet of iron. The wind at this altitude was a physical force, whipping Jalea's hair across her face. Below them, the city was a shimmering carpet of neon, but above, the sky was filled with the rhythmic thrum of a blacked-out chopper circling the spire. "There," Hae-ju pointed. A massive yellow maintenance crane hung over the abyss, used for the ongoing exterior cleaning of the tower. A small gondola was tethered to the rail. Suddenly, the roof door splintered. 2 men in tactical gear surged out, their rifle lights cutting through the darkness. Hae-ju didn't hesitate. She stepped in front of Jalea and Ivory, her stance rock solid despite the gale. She fired 3 shots, the crack of her pistol swallowed by the wind, forcing the gunmen to dive for cover behind the HVAC units. "Get in the gondola," Hae-ju commanded, firing again to keep their heads down. Jalea scrambled into the metal basket, pulling Ivory onto the floor. Hae-ju leaped in a second later, hitting the manual release. With a gut-wrenching lurch, the gondola swung out over the abyss, suspended by nothing but steel cables and the Ice Queen's iron will. As they drifted into the open air, the skyscraper, the glass fortress, seemed to shrink behind them, its glowing windows now a hive of traitors. Jalea looked at Hae-ju, who was reloading her magazine with trembling fingers. The mafia lady's facade was gone. She looked exhausted, human, and terrifyingly alone. "You saved us," Jalea rasped, looking at the woman who was supposed to be her employer. Hae-ju didn't look up, but her voice was steady. "Your daughter saved me. In my world, we pay our debts. From this moment, your life is tied to mine. If I fall, you fall. But as long as I breathe, no one touches that child." The gondola groaned as it descended into the humid, neon-lit belly of the city, finally touching down on the roof of a 6-story parking garage on the edge of Itaewon. They abandoned the metal cradle and descended the concrete stairs, emerging into the chaotic, sensory assault of the night market. Here, the air was a thick soup of grilled squid, diesel fumes, and the pounding bass of underground clubs. It was the only place in Seoul where a Black American woman and a wounded Korean socialite could blend into the restless international crowd. "Keep your head down," Haiju whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the silver pistol tucked into her waistband, hidden now by a discarded oversized hoodie Jalaiah had pulled from a lost and found bin. They moved through the narrow, twisting alleys that climbed the steep hills of the district. Every black sedan that slowed at a corner felt like a predator. Every group of men in dark suits standing outside a bar looked like a hit squad. Jalaiah felt the weight of Ivory in her arms, a heavy, warm reminder of the stakes. The little girl had stopped crying. She was eerily still, her eyes darting between the shadows as if she were learning to hunt. They ducked into a room salon that looked like a boarded-up basement. Inside, the hallway was lined with velvet curtains and the smell of stale beer. Haiju pushed past a startled bouncer, her eyes flashing with a cold authority that even a hoodie couldn't hide. She led them to a windowless VIP room in the very back, locking the heavy door with a click that echoed like a gunshot. Jalaiah slumped against the padded wall, sliding down to the floor. "We can't stay here. This is exactly where they'll look. Your old haunts." "They'll look for me at the hotels and the villas," Haiju countered, checking the magazine of her weapon. "They won't look for me in a place this pathetic. This is owned by a man who owes my father his life. It's the only soil and soul that hasn't been poisoned by my brother's money yet." Haiju sat across from them, the blue light of a flickering television screen casting jagged shadows across her face. She looked at Ivory, who was tracing the patterns on the carpet with a small finger. "She's quiet," Haiju observed, her voice losing its edge for a fleeting second. "She's listening," Jalaiah replied, her voice raspy. "That's the problem, isn't it? She knows too much." Haiju didn't look away. "In my world, knowledge is a death sentence. But tonight, it's the only reason I'm alive. Your daughter didn't just hear words. She heard a frequency. She heard the shift in the wind." A soft vibration hummed through the table. Haiju's burner phone lit up with a single, scrambled message. The syndicate was closing in on the district. The streets of Itaewon were no longer a hiding place. They were a met. The stale air of the VIP room felt smaller by the second. Haiju sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her silver pistol resting on the low table like a centerpiece. She was staring at a photograph on her burner phone, a grainy image of her brother, Dong-gun, entering a private club in Gangnam with the very men who had tried to kill them. The mask of the loyal, lesser sibling had finally slipped, revealing a face of hungry ambition. "He was always the one who stayed behind," Haiju whispered, her voice a jagged line of grief. "I thought I was protecting him from the dirt of this life. I thought he was safe because he was soft." Jalaiah watched her from the floor, her arm wrapped tightly around Ivory. "Soft men are often the most dangerous," she said quietly. "They spend too much time watching from the shadows, counting what they think they're owed." Ivory looked up from her mother's lap, her gaze moving between the two women. She tugged at Jalaiah's sleeve, then pointed at the phone in Haiju's hand. "The man with the loud voice," she said, her Korean syllables small but steady. "He told the phone that the little brother was already wearing the ring." Haiju froze. Her hand went instinctively to her own finger, where a heavy signet ring of white gold and jade sat, the symbol of the Yoon family's authority. "The ring?" she repeated, her eyes boring into Ivory's. "Which ring, Ivory?" "The one with the green stone," Ivory replied in English, then mimicked a conversation she'd ever heard. "Tell the docs that Dong-gun has the jade now. The queen is a ghost." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a final, irrevocable truth. Haiju closed her eyes, and for a moment the Ice Queen looked fragile. The jade ring Ivory described was a replica, a ceremonial piece Dong-gun must have commissioned months ago. He hadn't just planned an assassination, he had planned a coronation. He had been living in the future of her death for a long time. He didn't just want the money, Haiju gasped, opening her eyes. The grief was gone now, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury that made the blue light of the room seem to dim. He wanted to erase me. He wanted the world to think I simply vanished. She looked at Jalaiah, and for the first time there was a grim, mutual understanding between them. They were both mothers in a way, Jalaiah to a child, Haiju to an empire, and both had been betrayed by the world they tried to build. "He's at the docks," Haiju said,
standing up and checking the slide of her weapon with a lethal plaque. He's waiting for the final shipment to seal his deals with the triads. If he signs those papers with that fake ring, the Seirun is his. Then we stop him, Julia said, standing up and pulling Ivory close. Not for the Empire, but because he tried to kill my daughter to get it.
The Incheon docks were a sprawling graveyard of rusted iron and salt-crusted steel. Fog rolled off the yellow sea, thick enough to swallow the beam of the lighthouses and dampen the mechanical shriek of the gantry cranes. Julia stayed low, her heart hammering against the cold metal of a blue shipping container. Behind her, Ivory huddled in the small gap between the steel walls, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. Haiju moved through the mist like a wraith. She had shed the oversized hoodie, revealing a tactical vest she'd liberated from the room salon's hidden stash. The Ice Queen was no longer a socialite, she was a general. She signaled to Julia, 2 fingers raised, then a sharp point toward the central loading bay, where a cluster of black sedans sat idling, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea predators. Stay here, Haiju's voice was a ghost of a whisper. If the shooting starts, run for the water. There's a pilot boat at Pier 7 with a man named Han. Tell him the Winter Lily sent you. I'm not leaving you to fight a private army alone, Julia hissed, her fingers tightening around a heavy iron crowbar she'd scavenged. Before Haiju could argue, the heavy thrum of a crane engine roared to life. High above, a massive spreader beam began to descend, dangling over the center of the bay. Donggun stood there, his silver suit glowing under the halogen lights, his hand raised to reveal the fake jade ring. He was surrounded by a dozen men in tactical gear, their rifles leveled at the shadows. Come out, sister. Donggun's voice was amplified by a megaphone, distorted and mocking. The child already told the truth. Why hide in the dark like a coward? Julia saw the trap before Haiju did. The men weren't just guarding the bay, they were flanking the container stacks, closing the exits. She looked up at the crane. The operator wasn't looking at the ground, he was looking at the stack where they were hiding. Haiju, move, Julia screamed. She lunged forward, grabbing Haiju's collar and hauling her back just as the crane operator released the locking pins. A 40-foot steel container plummeted from the sky, slamming into the concrete with a bone-shattering boom that sent a shockwave through Julia's teeth. The impact sprayed sparks and rust like shrapnel. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the docks erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes strobed through the fog. Julia didn't have a gun, but she had the geography of the shadows. As Haiju returned fire, a rhythmic crack, crack, crack of silver-plated precision, Julia realized the container hadn't just been a weapon, it was a shield. The controls, shouted Julia over the roar of a second engine. If we take the crane, we take the bay. She looked at Ivory, then at the ladder of the nearest gantry. The server and the queen were no longer just survivors. They were the architects of a counterstrike, and the shipping yard was about to become Donggun's cage.
The fog over Incheon began to lift with the rising sun, revealing a landscape of twisted metal and a silence that felt heavy with the weight of a fallen dynasty. Donggun was gone, escorted into the shadows by men whose loyalty had shifted back to the true queen the moment the first strap of blood hit the concrete. Haiju stood on the edge of the pier, her silver pistol finally holstered, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the gray sea met the pale morning sky. She looked older, the porcelain mask of her face now etched with the permanent lines of a woman who had killed her own blood to save her soul. Julia sat on a rusted bollard, Ivory asleep in her lap, wrapped in a tactical jacket that smelled of gunpowder and expensive cologne. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a hollow ache in her bones and a terrifying uncertainty about the future. In the distance, the black sedans were being loaded with the dead and the defeated, but here, at the water's edge, the air was finally clear. The lawyers have already filed the paperwork, Haiju said, her voice raspy but resonant. She didn't turn around, but her shadow stretched toward Julia. Your mother's medical debts in the States have been settled in full. Your visa has been upgraded to an executive status. You are no longer a guest in this country, Julia. You are a permanent fixture. Julia looked down at Ivory's peaceful face. You didn't have to do that. We were just trying to survive the night. You did more than survive, Haiju replied, turning to face her. The Ice Queen's eyes were no longer empty. They held a fierce, burning gratitude. I spent my life building a cage, thinking it was a throne. Your daughter saw through the bars before I did. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside sat the true jade signet ring, the deep green stone glowing in the dawn light. She didn't put it on. Instead, she handed it to Julia. I am retiring the Sarun name.
Haiju said. The underworld is for men like my brother. I am moving the assets into a legitimate foundation. Logistics, education, and protection for those the system forgets. I want you to run the outreach. I want someone who knows what it's like to be invisible, to lead the search for those who still are. Jelia looked at the ring, then at the woman who had become her unlikely sister-in-arms. The silver platter was gone, replaced by a seat at a table she had once only been allowed to serve. She took the ring, not as a symbol of power, but as a promise. We're going to need a lot of translators, Jelia said with a tired, genuine smile. Haiju looked at the sleeping ivory and nodded. We already have the best one in Seoul. As the sun finally broke over the Crane Line horizon, the three of them walked away from the docks, leaving the ghosts of the mafia behind, to build a dynasty that wouldn't need shadows to survive.